Certainly it's a pleasure to be able to be here this evening and to present the last of this series of lessons. The elders have been talking about the possibility of a series next year, and I may introduce that when Mike's on vacation, and then we'll see whether there's any interest or not. I did want to mention, John mentioned this morning, the Discover magazine on the back. If you've not read that, and I know it's written for 6th, 7th graders, but I get a lot out of it every time. But it certainly does have a lot of information that really goes along with the lesson that tonight's lesson. And so I'd encourage you to pick one up. If you're to pick one up, and if you're an adult, read it and then put it back. Right? And we'd like to have these available for our kids because they are very beneficial to them as they go through this problem of being able to answer the skeptics, their teachers. They go to museums like the Carnegie, the Smithsonian, Natural Museum, histories everywhere. They go to college and they're college professors in, well, just about every field of science, and in some cases of math, they try to draw some of that in. But certainly our young people need to be able to fortify their faith and to realize that there is evidence for the flood of Noah. We've tried to talk about in this series things that maybe don't get a lot of pulpit time, as it were. And all three of these lessons I present just little pieces at other evidences, presentations that I do. But I know this one tonight I've never presented very much of this other than just one or two slides. So we're going to jump very quickly into this simply because time is short, and like I said, there's a lot of evidence around the globe. I'm going to just mention a few things outside of the state of West Virginia, but it's incredible what we can see in the world around us here in West Virginia that proves that we were in a flood, that a flood occurred that covered everything in West Virginia. And so we'll certainly take a look at that. If you recognize the picture that's on the screen right now, of course, that's the Grand Canyon. One of the biggest problems for evolutionists and, well, the old age or geologists especially, those that believe in what's called uniformitarianism, which means that the present is the key to the past. And that means that if we see today where rock layers are being laid down in swamps and mud at the rate of 1 inch every 100,000 years, if you have a rock that's 10 feet thick, then it takes 100 trillion years for the rock layers to form. Well, that's not the case because, and we could spend the entirety of tonight's lesson on the evidences from geology and never leave the Grand Canyon. And that's part of what the Discover magazine talks about. But we're not going to do that. I want to point out things that, matter of fact, about, let's see, 4 or 5 families drove by the evidence, coming one way or the other on quarter age tonight. Some of the things that we'll look at that really does help to point to the fact that the flood occurred. Of course, Genesis 7, verses 19 and 20, the waters, talking about the flood of Noah, the flood of Genesis, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upwards did the water prevail, and the mountains were covered. And of course, in the very first lesson, we talked about what did the original earth look like? Well, we don't know. We're not sure. So how high were the mountains? And remember that with God, anything is possible. And so the idea that God could produce enough water, or the subterranean oceans that are down under the earth now could provide enough water, but we're not even sure that all the mountains were, where they are today. That may not have happened until the year of the flood and breaking up of the fountains of the deep and so many other things. Well, where's the evidence? 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 6 says, whereby the world that then was, that's before the flood, being overflowed with water, perished. Now, again, this particular slide is not from West Virginia, but it certainly points out that there is great evidence. This is an area of West United States called the scablands. And the scablands occur in Washington, Oregon, and parts of Idaho. And this picture is, I mean, that's several hundred acres that they're flying over there. And you can look and you can easily see that this area was in a tremendous flood. Geologists absolutely agree with that. This area, the channeled scablands in those 3 states, parts of those 3 states, had to have experienced a tremendous flood. Now, they're not going to associate it with the flood of Noah. Just keep that in mind. Of course, they say, yeah, there was a tremendous flood here, and it carved out huge canyons and moved boulders the size of this building hundreds of miles, not just feet. It would move them hundreds of miles. And so it had to be a colossally big flood. But the evidence is there. The world that then was, before the days of Noah, perished, being overflowed with water. And we all know what kind of damage floodwaters can do. We've seen in Texas on TV, and of course here in West Virginia we saw the 85 and other events that water has a tremendous amount of power. And so the world that God created prior to the flood was gone. It's disappeared. It was destroyed. And so, but there should be, and there is evidence, like the channeled scablands, for the presence of the occurrence of flood. Now, besides the channeled scablands and the Grand Canyon, the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, there's an area there of about several thousand square miles that absolutely a great flood occurred there. The geologists don't have any ability to deny it. Again, they don't go back and relate it to the flood of Genesis. They say, well, it was a regional flood or just in a small area. Well, a relatively small area. But there are lots of evidence. And in the field of geology, and I don't want to get deep into this, the graduate work I did in geology left me confused. But when in geology, there's something, if the evidence that we look at when we look at the rocks doesn't fit their preconceived notion about how rocks form and how they get the way they are, and erosional effects and so on, formation of coal, etc., they have their own term that's made up to explain it away. It's called unconformities. And they have nonconformities, which are unconformities. They have angular unconformities, and they have disconformities. And I'm not going to go into all of those. But my point is that they actually have established a reason to explain when things don't answer, don't look in reality the way they're supposed to, according to their uniformitarianism, which again, the present is the key to the past. And so processes we see has shaped the earth over 4.5 billion years. And so, and like I said, there's an awful lot to that. That's one slide out of about 3 chapters in a graduate level textbook. So, and again, time doesn't permit to do that. But I want to look at and we'll look at this list again, because we're going to talk about them real quick. All right? There's extensive sedimentary rock, and we'll talk about that. The rapid evidence for rapid deposition or depositing of rocks. Rock layers or strata, strata simply means layer, that are folded rather than cracked and broken. Fossil formation, fossils of ocean creatures that, virtually every rock you pick up on the top of the mountain up here on Laurel Mountain is an ocean fossil. It's got an ocean fossil and rapid plant deposition, and then polystratic fossils, which I, in all honesty, thanks to Jim and Nikki back there, I never believed I would ever have the chance to observe these in place in what's called stishu. But I have, and so we'll look at that. So let's very quickly go through generally 1 or 2 slides on each of these, because they said this is about 2 weeks worth of, if I were teaching as a class, it would take me a long time. Vast sedimentary deposits. The entire globe is covered with rock that is termed sedimentary. There are 3 types of rocks, metamorphic, sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous. The igneous rock are those that are produced by volcanoes. Metamorphic are rocks that have been changed by heat and pressure. And then there's sedimentary rocks that are formed, as it sounds, from sediment. That means things, dirt, mud, settling out of water. About 75 to 80% of all of the land masses on the earth are covered by rocks produced in water or by water. In West Virginia, it's about 99.9% of all. There's only one place in West Virginia, I do know where it's at, in West Virginia where you can find anything other than a sedimentary rock. That's the Eastern Panhandle, Jefferson County. You can find small deposits where it's eroded away of metamorphic rock, a rock that's been changed by heat and pressure. And so, how do you get that much of the Earth's surface covered by a rock that is produced in water if there was not a worldwide flood? That in and of itself is by and far the best piece of evidence, because there is no explanation for that in modern geology. They don't have an answer. Did it have to be covered by water? Yes. You know, when did that water occur? Well, sometime in the past. Their answers are really scientific. I mean, they really nail it down because they don't have a clue. Now, I understand there's caustic sedimentary rocks and conglomerate sediment. You know, I'm not going to go into all that, and I understand all of that. And like I said, if you really want to know, let me come a couple evenings this week and I'll explain it to you. But it's just not necessary. The most of the world's surface is covered by rocks that were produced by water or in water. Well, let's move on. Rapid deposition of layers, and these pictures are from Quarter H. Matter of fact, everyone that came out of Elkins drove right by them when they first opened that road up. I, being one of the weird people that looks at rocks a lot, picks them up. I spent a lot of time, I actually made sketches, took pictures and made sketches, and I spent a lot of hours, looking at this. But and here you can see this line represents the layers of this layer of rock. You've got a rock layer here, a rock layer up here, then you've got this lower layer, which is unconsolidated rock. That simply means rock that somehow was deposited fast enough so it didn't get glued together. And so you can actually see that along the road. You actually see those darker layers, and they'll actually erode out faster because there's no glue holding that material together. But that line shows where the boundary is. That's impossible in uniformitarianism. They've got to come up with an explanation for how this layer was laid down. And in uniformitarianism, generally the idea is that the rocks on the bottom are older than the rocks on top. Generally, unless there's a non or nonconformity. And in a nonconformity, you can have young rocks on top of old rocks. And they can't explain that one either, but that's another part of the story. But they've got to be able to explain how these irregular patterns form. Here's another one, and this has it's an impossibility to explain. We've got rock layer A and rock layer A here. So those two rocks are the same. Then this is which I've labeled B, and up here is rock layer B. This is what happens. This is what this evidence shows along Quarter H, that somehow this older layer of rock somehow absorbed a big chunk, a boulder, of the upper layer, a rock layer that's supposedly younger. And how it got itself down in there, so that if there's millions of years, from here to here are millions or hundreds of millions of years, and from here to here up to the next layer is another couple hundred million years. There's simply no explanation for this, and that was the first thing that I ever saw when I was driving Quarter H into Elkins. I looked at that and said, that's an absolute impossibility. Using uniformitarianism principles, this doesn't happen. This looks more like waters, that there was some very violent activities going put down very similarly at the same time or very close to the same time. And somehow, while this was still wet, a boulder dropped like if you had a muddy puddle or a puddle with mud in it. You drop a rock in it, and that the rock that you drop in the mud goes, and the rock layer, the mud layer comes up around it. Well, then that rock hardened, and that's exactly what it looks like happened. And so certainly these rapid deposition, well, if you turn and go towards my house on Quarter H, you come to what's called a chimney rock formation. And I've looked at this one for several years, and actually really wished I'd gotten pictures about a year or two ago because it lost some of the top part of this particular formation. But what a chimney rock is, this layer down here has somehow extended the layer in this chimney-like structure. Here's another picture of it from the other side. You can see there's actually a couple different chimney structures. So something has caused erosion of rock layers but it left that one little chimney structure stuck up there. That's an unconformity. That doesn't fit the standard explanation for standard geology explanations of how these rocks formed over 4.5 billion years. So certainly something very unusual, and can I explain it? Absolutely not. The only way to explain it would have been there and see it, or wait till we get to heaven and ask God what happened. How did that occur? But chimney rocks are very unusual, and like I said, the fact that there's one right out the road here, is quite unusual. Well, let's go over into Grant County, and this one I've looked at since I was in college. Just outside of Jordan Run area, the Baker Rocks area, from Mount Seneca to Petersburg. Off on the right, as you come down the hill, you see this formation. This rock layer which exposed, and the river's down here. The river actually runs right underneath of this. Look, you can see that this mountain is rock layers that have been folded. All right? Now, I don't know, but you understand that the idea that geologists have is that these rock layers, sedimentary especially, are all laid flat. And then, due to tectonic pressures, the sides were pushed. Well, I've got news for you. If you had a cinder block and you had two rams that were able to push hard enough, that cinder block isn't going to bend. What's it going to do when you push those two rams together? It's just going to break in the middle. It's just going to come apart. It's just going to snap. Okay? Well, that's not what happens here. That's not what this shows. This shows that these rock layers are perfectly bent. The only way to get this is for these rock layers to be folded during what? While they were wet. They had to be wet when these folded. Absolutely impossible not to have a seam, very clear-cut seam, and I've stood along the road there with binoculars and looked at that. There are no cracks, there are no seams. Those layers are just absolutely perfectly folded. And so that entire, and I would say several hundred feet thick layer of rocks had to be folded while it was still soft, while it was still wet. Like there's a great deposition. Imagine, the earth's covered with water, there's all this erosion, there's all of this sand and mud and stuff, and it's settling down, and then the mountains start to be pushed up while it's all wet, while it's all soft, and those layers just folded instead of being snapped and broken. Well, along Quarter H, again, I like Quarter H. It gets a great, where they cut these little rock layers, man, it's a wonderful place to study geology. Well, in Grant County, this is over towards Moorfield, headed that direction from Mount Stormover. You can see that there are layers of folded rock that were exposed. This is in, as a matter of fact, that first slide is right up here, and the last slide is right down here. So what you've got is you've got a layer that comes down, then goes up again, then you can see it comes down and back up again, and then this one here follows that. And so you've got a wave of rock layers. Again, absolutely no cracks, and this is two pictures pieced together, so wait a minute, there's a crack. No, that was just two pictures that I slid together in order to show, that folding condition of those rock layers. Again, this type of evidence proves that it has to have been deposited and then folded while it was still malleable or pliable, while it was still wet, so that it would fold like that instead of breaking. This one isn't my picture, but I did want to show this. If you're familiar with Route 68 outside of Cumberland, between Cumberland and Hancock, is Sidling Hill. Well, in Sidling Hill, the mountain comes up like this, and normally rock layers are expected to be just like that underneath. They should be arched up, down, and anticline, as it's called. That's not going to be on the test, so don't worry. This is a syncline. All right? They're dipping down instead of going up like this. When the construction crews first started excavating this cut, they were dumbfounded, literally dumbfounded. And they called geologists in, and the deeper it got, the worse it got. Well, the better it got for us, the worse it got for them, because there is absolutely no explanation. Their explanation is that this was the valley of a hill that was much, much higher, and the rest of the mountains were all eroded away. How much gullibility does it take to believe that? There are no cracks. These rock layers, obviously, when they were pushed together and pushed, in this case, downwards, were very soft and pliable at the time. And from here to there, I think it's 260 some feet. So, and without doubt, is there anyone that in here doesn't believe if we were to dig another 600 feet or 200 feet straight down, what would we still find? You'd still find the syncline. You'd still find that folded condition. So the ability of rocks to be folded and stood up. Now, there are places where you'll find rock layers that are snapped and broken. So we do find evidence of that. But these places in West Virginia aren't the only places where rock layers are folded without breaking. It is very common in the geologic world. Well, let's move on to fossils. These aren't found in West Virginia. This is a slide from the Green River Formation in Wyoming. 31 years ago almost, I was sitting in the Rocky Mountains collecting these fish for my 40th birthday, I think it was. That was my birthday present, sitting and picking up fossils in the Green River Formation. Fossils are everywhere. Of course, fossils are the evidence, the remains of some sort of animal. Everybody knows what fossils are, one sort or another. And again, these are fish that this is called a mass extinction fossil, because these fish all died at the same time. Matter of fact, it looked like they may have been swimming in a school, and what happened? They were immediately buried and preserved, so much so that some of the fossils that I have, some of the fish that I was able to collect, you can see scales still on their backs. They were fossilized so quickly that it's really crazy. Well, on the mountains of West Virginia, there are two types of fossils. If you went with me fossil hunting, okay, I tell you there are two types of fossils that you can find in West Virginia: ocean creatures and trees. Those are the two. Nothing else. We don't find any dinosaurs. We don't find any. We find seashells. We find ocean creatures, and we find plants. Of course, this brachiopods, and you can see two different brachiopods here. This actually, part of the shell still remains in these fossils. And from Moorfield, the sandstone and the sedimentary rock, again, sandstone, limestone, these are all sedimentary rocks. Break them open, you find the cast. You find where the shellfish was buried and then dissolved. All of the minerals inside of the limestone shell of that shellfish dissolved. And this is the interior cast. In other words, you're seeing sort of the inside after it's all been eroded and digested away. And every rock, like I said, I can take you from Quarter H all the way into Tucker County, as far as Laurel Mountain goes. And the top of the mountains up there, every rock you pick up are sea creatures. At one point, West Virginia was totally covered by an ocean. Again, you go back and the evolutionary geologists, the uniformitarians, the old age geologists are going to have to say, yeah, we're not sure when, but boy, back there sometime we were under an ocean. Well, to me, when God covered the world 15 cubits deep, that would be a good time to say there was an ocean in West Virginia, all right? Because there was. All right, so the ocean fossils in West Virginia. Well, this is another one. This is called a crinoid, and they're, sometimes they call them sea flowers. They live on the bottom of the ocean even today. So we find them fossilized. Of course, you find shellfish and things like that fossilized as well, or in the ocean as well even today. But the crinoids are known for this sort of flower-like head, which they would open up and they would use those limbs or legs to kind of stir the lard up, and they would eat tiny things in the ocean. And then they would use these long stalk-like structures to stand up off the ocean floor. Well, in Randolph County, the old aggregates going into town, just before you come to the crib, turn off, go to Kent's house, that rock layer right there, if you climb up there, this is what you'll find. You'll find crinoid shell or stems. These are the stems of those particular structures. These are the ones that were setting down in the rock like that. So the base, the crinoids. And literally tons and tons of these present in Randolph County, Barber County, trilobites in Hardin County, and I could just go on and on and on about the number of fossils in West Virginia that are sea creatures. Well, then we have the other type of fossils that are present. Those are plants. Rapid burial plants. Lepidodendron, I have 2 fossils of that. And these are literally the trunks of the trees that were buried quickly and left their impressions on in the sand. These are all sandstone rocks. And this one happens to be the lenticels of a large palm tree looking thing. Not only were we at one point under an ocean, but at one point we were kind of a tropical rainforest. We had palm trees, right? Because these plants look more like palm trees than anything else. This is a rock that when we built our house in 1980, a long time ago, had to bust and blast rock out of the foundation to get it down in the ground. Still didn't get it deep enough for Norma, but it's another story. All right? But in those rocks, as we used dynamite and sledgehammer, and were trees laid every which way. This is a boulder. It's about, probably from here to there, about 10, 15 feet, about 10 feet across, and about 6 feet thick. Those lines represent tree fossils that are present. Then on the side, you can see 3 different tree layers. As a matter of fact, there's another one right there that I didn't even highlight. And so what we find is that these trees, and we know what happens out in the woods, when trees fall over, do they fossilize? They never fossilize, they rot. That's all they do. They become food for other animals, termites and ants, but these plants, these trees, were buried rapidly in sediment like a what? Like a flood. And, without a doubt, to get layers and layers and layers of these trees, there had to be vast numbers of plants available. And then, of course, Roger's fossil, Roger's brother-in-law's fossil, that I still haven't been able to talk him out of yet. The rapid burial of a flower. I mean, it's easy to understand how you might be able to bury a tree with bark and things like that and see the remains. But to see the petals of a flower, which was in the Sago coal mine, right, Roger? Yeah. His brother-in-law worked in the Sago mine before the disaster there and found this flower fossil. And it had to be, let's face it, how long do flowers last if they're not buried quickly? Well, I think I had a flower the other night at graduation, and it's already wilted and boutonniere that they gave us to wear. And it's already wilted it certainly, something like this had to be very, very, very fast. Well, just want to mention dinosaurs because dinosaurs, of course, are, of great interest, especially to our kids. But around the world, these dots represent dinosaur mass graveyards. Now, we're not talking about one dinosaur. We're talking about thousands. We're talking in one area. The Dinosaur National Monument in Jensen, Utah. Norma and I and Brian had the chance to go see that. You see this massive wall of rock, and there are hundreds of bones of dinosaurs. And there'll be let's say that there's a head and neck here, and a leg down here, and another part up here. You ask the docents, the guides, well, how did they all get spread out like that and not all they were in a flood when they died? Okay. Dead animals float. During the 85 flood, we body searched and spent several weeks up and down the Potomac River Valley there, and saw a lot of dead animals that had been killed in the flood. And even though it had only been a few days, they were, legs were starting to fall off. Well, that's what happened in Dinosaur National Park. And, very seldom do we find dinosaurs where they're, tail to head laid out together. But there are vast graveyards all over the world. Well, let's move on to the coal deposits if we're running out of time quick here, folks. Coal, unusually, these are 2 layers of coal, again, quarter inch, okay? As you're going down the hill to the Boy Scout camp, there's 2 layers, again, this picture was taken right there, and this layer of coal and this seam of coal here. One of the things that is observed, and really a head scratcher for geologists, is how come these coal layers are almost always perfectly flat? So that the mine down the house about from where Roger lives, down Century, they use long wall miners, meaning that the head goes up and down, and they're cutting all of the coal because the coal layer is just nearly perfectly flat. All right. Well, how do these layers of coal form in that kind of situation? Coal is not uncommon, and yet it's very uncommon. This map, and I realize you can't read all this, of course, here's Africa and Europe and Russia and China and United States, South America. These little red areas, these little darker areas represent the major coal deposits in the world. One of the biggest problems for geologists is, excuse me, how do you bury enough plants to get all of these massive coal formations? One of the theories that creationists have put forward is, and people that support the Genesis flood is, that the year of the flood, the world was a tropical paradise. Plants float whenever they're killed and washed up, and we've seen the river down here. Trees floating down the river, get caught on the bridge and whatnot. Okay, they were all floating in this massive waters in the year of the flood, and then started to be deposited. And if you look, just left of this Appalachian region, the mountains are here. Well, what happens if the water is carrying these massive log jams, masses of plants, and they run up against the mountains? Mountains here, the Bighorn Mountains and the Rocky Mountains. So the way coal has been formed, the flat layers, present some serious problems. Of course, the fact that, Roger, how deep's the coal mine out there? 700 feet deep? About 700 feet down. Now stop and think about this. You're an old age uniformitarianist geologist. So I have got to bury hundreds of millions of tons of plants and cover it with 700 feet of rock. How does that happen? The Earth isn't that old. 4.5 billion years isn't going to give you that kind of time. And so coal formation, rapid plant burial in order to produce it down. How long does it take to make coal? Oh, it takes hundreds of thousands of about a half hour. We can make coal in a laboratory in about half an hour. Get a hydraulic press, get up to about 300 tons, put plant material in it, you squeeze and you squeeze and you squeeze, and it will turn to peat in about a half an hour. And Mount St. Helens has proven this, that trees that were blown over when the volcano erupted, Mount St. Helens erupted, floating in Spirit Lake, some of them floated normally, but a lot of them had the root balls on them. Well, the root balls would cause them to turn upright, the root ball being heavier than the rest of the log, and would then settle down into the layers of mud that was being deposited. Now, some of them, of course, could be buried in a prone position or laying out position, but many of them were deposited in an upright position. This then, as layers begin to form underneath of that, or along the side of that, produces what is known as a polystratic fossil, a tree fossil. That simply means multiple layers. Tree had to stand there for whatever period of time it took to be buried. Now again, if I go out here into a swamp, and I've waded through a few swamps in my time, and I take a big stick and I jam it down in the ground and say, no, I want that tree to be there for the next 100 million years while more mud is deposited, and finally gets buried and becomes a fossil. How many of you think I've lost my sanity? Everyone's hand should go up because I have. We know what's going to happen. Any part that's out of the water is going to do what? It's going to rot. Termites are getting to it, plants are getting, around Barber County, the woodpeckers will get a hold of it and just beat the snot out of it. Chips flying everywhere. It's like you're going through a wood chipper. This is a polystratic fossil that, again, thanks to Jim and Nikki back there, they were, well, there we go. They saw this fossil, that was the only one you guys had found, right, at the time, was just this one fossil near their hunting camp over in Gilbert County, I think, over that direction. And you kind of get a relative size. This is up on a bank in a layer that has multiple layers of rock, that is deposited in. Looks like they're probably the same type of rock, so deposition must have been pretty quick. But you can see the relative size. This one is gone, or most of it. The only part that's left right now, when I was able to get over there, is that bottom chunk. It's been picked over. College classes from Glenville have probably got part of it in their classes at Glenville. And the rock and the tree does continue on up in, so I was able to measure from there down, so it's about 5.5, almost 6 feet long. Well, since we found that, and I got to look at that, went on down this same layer of rock, and I don't think you guys had seen these, had you? We found two more polystratic tree fossils. Now, these are so uncommon that, like I said, you could have knocked me over when Jim first mentioned it. I thought, this guy didn't know what he's talking about. Jim did know what he was talking about. Okay, there's no question that these are tree fossils that had to be buried in an upright position, whether in the flood, because of the root ball at the bottom, and of course it's hard to excavate, and I did not want to go digging on someone else's bank, someone else's property, I was just tickled enough just to get there and get up there and get pictures and do some measurements, but again, you can see that layer, and it goes up into the layers of rock above. The layers of rock above probably are a little bit harder, meaning that it doesn't erode quite as well because there's a shelf of rock in that area. So polystrate fossils, trees, very difficult to explain in terms of uniformitarianism. Now, not only do we see in the world of geology, we see trees standing across multiple layers, supposedly over millions of years, but there are animal fossils standing that way. There's one, I believe it's in southern France, that is a whale. Its tail is up here, and its head is down here. It was buried and standing on its head. Again, how you get that whale to stand there without rotting for millions of years unless it was not there for millions of years, but was buried quickly in the matter of a few weeks or months in the course of the flood of Genesis. And so these types of fossils, now you can go out west and you can find these polystrate fossils. I'm, like I said, there's a big mountain beyond this, or I probably would have tried to find out who owned it and go look at the rest of it, but probably they're all buried, and who knows how many, whether it was a forest, whether it was just deposited in the flood of Noah. But like I said, that's almost a religious experience for me. Okay, I've often said that going to Mount St. Helens, where geology happened not over hundreds of millions of years, but happened in hours, would be like a pilgrimage for me to the Holy Land. Okay, because the formations, the canyons, the erosion, the layers that were laid down 150 feet thick, layers of rock that were deposited in 6 hours. Catastrophes have a way of messing up the normal explanations that evolutionists and geologists have for explaining things away. Well, rapid burials of animals, and this wasn't West Virginia. This was from the Green River Formation. If you can tell what that is, what is it? It's a fly. It's a regular fly. Okay, blue bottle fly. And this, we went out, and that was my 40th birthday, and Norma paid for me to go into a professional quarry, and the guy, when he found out it was a science teacher, said, come down with me, I'll show you some stuff. And we went down and we found at least 4 flies, fossilized. And that was in the garbage pile. They just throw this stuff away. But, how do you bury a fly and not have it decompose? Well, obviously you don't. All right, so as we wrap this up, the proofs then from geology, vast sedimentary deposits around the world, the evidence of rapid deposition from Porter Age here in Barber County, the folding of rocks instead of breaking. All right, they had to be laid down and folded while they were in a soft, pliable condition. The fossil formations, ocean fossils in West Virginia. Tell me that West Virginia wasn't under an ocean, and I'll say then you have to explain every one of them seashells. How did they get there? Okay, and it's not just that mountain; it's virtually every mountain in the Appalachian chain. All right, rapid deposition of plants, and then the polystrate fossils of West Virginia. Geology proves what God said, that the world that then was perished, being overflowed with water. These are evidences that the flood occurred. No question about it. It had to have occurred, or somebody has got some explaining to do. All right? Somebody has got to come up with an explanation for how these things ended up, whether it be the polystratic fossils or the folded rocks or the seashells on top of Laurel Mountain. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. Peter says this, when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water, the like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us. We know that God gave Noah the chance to preach to the sinful world. 120 years. He was a preacher of righteousness. His manner of life, and then his telling them to prepare for something that was unseen. Today, of course, we know that water saved Noah, just like the waters of baptism can save us eternally. Everyone that was in that ark and everything that was in that ark that breathed air in its nostrils survived. Of course, if you were an air breather, had nostrils, and you were outside the ark, you died. All of humanity other than those 8 souls. Question is, you can have that same salvation by being added to the church, being baptized. Water that saved Noah, the same water that we've got here in the baptistry, can save us, can save you. Or you can be restored to faithfulness. And I wanted to wrap this up with Noah invited the lost of the pre-flood world to come to the safety of the ark. Just like today, we invite anyone that's interested and is willing to listen to come to the safety of the church. Noah warned about these things for 120 years, of things unseen. Folks, the world is going to flood. It's going to be destroyed. If you're not in the ark, you die. All right? Today, aren't we doing the same thing? We warn of things yet unseen. How many of us have ever seen eternity? Well, we're all alive, so we haven't seen eternity. Just as soon as we die, will we see eternity? Yeah, then all of a sudden, our eyes are opened, as it were. Even though we leave our eyes here, we'll know. Just like the rich man and Lazarus. So today, we warn of things that are not seen, and of course that being eternity with God. Tonight, I know the primary lesson has not been one that dealt with spiritual issues, but let's face it, there's a great deal of comparison between salvation in Noah and his family and those that the living things in the ark and those that will be saved eternally that are added and part of his church, where he has promised to save those that are found there. This evening, if you need to answer God's call to repentance, to salvation, being added to the Lord